Hello, this is Lendon over from Visionary Universe. Welcome to a new episode for superluminal.tv. I'm excited to show you guys this really visually fascinating particle simulation, and throughout the video I'll be presenting how you can create an effect like this yourselves. We should be covering some pretty fundamental techniques that can be a real breakthrough depending on what skill level you're coming from. But besides that, hopefully this will be just a good opportunity to spark some creative ideas as well. So some of you may be wondering how in the world an effect like this was created inside After Effects. Good question. Well, the trick lies in how we use this brand new plugin for After Effects called Stardust. And I can't wait to show you guys what this effect can do. Mainly the flexibility and control you have over the particles. Let me show you what I mean briefly. So you pretty much have unlimited control in the fact that you can just keep applying different effects and adjustments, like you have particles and emitters, and you can drag in some turbulence and more turbulence and forces, and there's really no specific limit to the number of effectors or nodes you can connect to the simulation. So I can't wait to show you guys how all of these nodes and effects come together to create some really sweet stuff. So why don't we begin? Alrighty, so we're going to be creating something like this at first. It's really cool, turbulent, dynamic particle structure. This is going to be really cool. Let's go ahead and get started with it. Alright, so let's go ahead and create a new composition and make it about 5 or 6 seconds. And the first thing we need to do is create a motion for these particles. So there's several ways to do this. We can create a new null object and go over here to motion sketch and do start capture and just kind of move this around, create this kind of natural particle motion. You can do it like that, do manual keyframes, but what I did, I just recorded a real life video of someone moving a wand around and then just tracked that motion and applied it to a null object. So it kind of creates this natural motion since I tracked a real life object. So I'll copy those null objects, and the other null object is like a background motion. So I copied the shaking of the camera, the motion of the camera, to kind of create also a natural background motion. But if you don't want to do that, you can obviously use this motion sketch window and create your own artificial motion. So now it's time to start adding some particles. So let's get to the Stardust part. Let's go ahead and create a new solid and call this Stardust. And you probably won't be able to guess what effect we're going to apply to this Stardust layer, and that is Superluminal Stardust. Okay, so you should have a window pop up here called Stardust. If you don't see it, go over here to Window, check Stardust, boom, it'll open. And you can start, and this is where you kind of control the simulation. Alright, so I'm going to kind of explain this in a basic level, because I'm sure there's a lot of people who don't know how to use Stardust yet. So this will kind of help people out getting started using this plugin. Now, I do want to mention, if you don't have a copy of Stardust yet, you can get it from superluminal.tv, and you can get a free trial. See, the free trial is great. It's perfectly functional. Get it from superluminal.tv so you can follow along with this tutorial. So let's go ahead and continue. So we have the emitter node and the particle node. And basically, we have the particle node connected to the emitter to basically tell this emitter to give birth to these particles. So that makes sense why we connected them. And that's how nodes work. So one really cool thing about Stardust is if you have like a big confusing project with lots of different nodes and effects, and it's hard to find certain parameters, what you can do is basically just click on any one of these nodes, boom, and it'll open up the effect parameters here, and that's really helpful. So let's go over here to this emitter node, and we can start changing some of the settings. So obviously first here we have the origin XY, and we can change this just to move around the birth of these particles. What I'd like to do is connect this origin XY to the motion of this null object. So we'll do this with an expression. If I go down here and hit tilde, it'll open this up full screen. What I'd like to do is open the position parameter of this null object, hit P, and we'll connect the origin XY to the position parameter of this particle motion. So let's add an expression to the origin XY, hold alternate, click the stopwatch, and we'll grab the pick whip and just choose the position of the particle motion. Boom. So check this out. Those particles are going to follow that null object. Really cool. Alright, so we can go down here to these particles and start making adjustments. We can change the size of these particles. Maybe we'll do something like 3. Just make a whole bunch of adjustments. But what I want to do right now is focus on the emitter. So we'll turn the number of particles up a lot, maybe times 100. So there's a lot of particles. And let me tell you one really cool thing about Stardust. You have a lot of control of your particles over their life. So here we have speed. But we also have speed over life, so we can control the speed over their lifetime, and that's really cool about Stardust because a lot of these parameters can be controlled over the particle's life. And I'll show you how this can be helpful. So this is when the particles are born, and here's where they die over here at the very end. And if we turn this down, so they're going to start out moving really fast, but then they're going to slow down. If we have the value at 50, that means they have 0 velocity at the end of their life. In fact, we have so much control, we can actually drag this below 50, and then they'll have negative motion. If we drag it all the way down, and it'll completely reverse the motion. So it'll open up, it'll shoot up, and then it'll collapse back down to that single point because there's positive motion and then negative motion. So you can kind of see what this looks like. Let's turn the speed down a little bit, maybe 130. And this is just really fun to play around with. It looks really cool. Check that out. We have this kind of stroke motion going on here. If you're me, this is pretty sweet. What I would like to do is make a few adjustments to this speed over life. So I'll actually turn this to Bezier, like that, there. Bring this down a little bit. Something kind of like that. Alright, so you can kind of see what's going on here. The particles collapse in. I do want a little bit of frizz at the end. So there's a little more negative motion than positive motion. They collapse back down to a single point, and then they actually go beyond that. So there's a little more negative motion than positive motion. So what we can do now is go over here to the particle over life, and then we'll go to the size. And this is going to change the size of these particles over life. So we can bring this down so that it fades out. Really cool. And then we can also change this to Bezier and maybe just kind of create a curve here. Okay. So these particles will, the size will go up and then they'll fade back, and the size will go back down all the way to 0. So that's really cool. So I hope you guys are kind of getting the hang of this so far. And this works pretty similar to most other effects, most other plugins. Pretty self-explanatory. We have the speed random. So, different properties like that. We also have the particles per second. So one thing about this is that the faster this emitter moves, the thinner these particles are spread out because it covers more space with a smaller amount of time, so it kind of spreads the particles out. So there's a way to kind of preserve the density of these particles, and what we'll do is we'll add an expression to these particles per second, and open this up again so we can see what's going on. And what I'll do is type in plus, and I'll pick whip the particle motion position, and then I'll do dot speed. Okay, so what this does is pluses the speed of this particle motion. It only makes a subtle effect, so we'll multiply this something like times 4. That'll make the speed of this emitter have a bigger effect on the amount of particles that are born. So we can see that the faster this emitter moves, the more particles that are born per second, so that we kind of preserve some of that density. So that's a really cool technique. Well guys, we got some of that cool stuff covered. Let's turn the opacity of these particles down a good bit, maybe to 8 or something like that. So turbulence can affect a multitude of different parameters or properties. But I think the most common, the most useful is the position offset. So this position adds position turbulence. And this is probably the most intuitive way to think about turbulences, as when it affects the position. So we'll turn this up to about 100. And we want to turn the noise scale up a little bit. So this will increase the size of that turbulence, right? We can increase it a lot, and then we have some large turbulence, or we can turn it down a bit, have a little bit smaller turbulence. So maybe 125 is fine. Noise levels, this adds like levels of complexity or detail. If we turn it down to 2, we have a lot less detail. Turn it down to 1, there's even less. But then we can turn it up to something like 4, and there's like a lot of different levels of complexity or detail. Let's leave it about 3. 3 is fine. And for the noise frequency, we'll do about 10s. Okay, pretty sweet. We got some nice turbulence going on here. But the problem is, the turbulence is fully applied at birth. So we want this to fade in. We want the turbulence to fade in after birth. So we have turbulence over life again. Over life comes in really handy. We'll turn the birth turbulence all the way down so there's no effect at first, and as the particles are born, they begin to distort and displace. So we'll turn this to Bezier because I want the turbulence to come on at the beginning pretty fast and then kind of slow down. So something kind of like that, add a little bend to it. And we have some nice turbulence. Let's take a preview of this. I want to see how it runs. Okay, pretty sweet, pretty sweet. I like how it collapses into a single point and then kind of frizzes off. So that looks pretty cool to me. So this is a really cool simulation so far, and one of the cool things about Stardust is you have unlimited amount of effects you can apply. So if we like this noise but we want to add some different type of noise to it, we can add another layer of turbulence. So let's go ahead and click here, add another turbulence node, and we'll connect this to the last turbulence node. And since this turbulence node is connected to the particles, this turbulence will also affect these particles. So it's like a chain, a network. Anything that's connected, whether it be through a common node or if it's along the chain, it's going to affect these particles. So let's go ahead and start making adjustments to this displacement. We want to affect the turbulence over life so that it doesn't distort at the very beginning. So we'll add a little Bezier again, so something kind of like that. And for the position, we'll do about 75, make it displace that position a bit. And for the noise scale, we'll do about 200 noise levels. We'll leave that at 3 again. For the amplitude, let's do something like 75, and you can kind of play around with these sliders to see exactly what they do. But we'll turn the noise amplitude up to about 75, and the noise frequency, maybe we'll turn this down to about 12. Looks cool. Remember, we do have some other options. We have the offset, so you can animate this to make the fractal noise move upward. We also have the fractal speed. So this is like the evolution of the turbulence, right? If we turn the fractal speed up to 2, it's actually going to evolve the turbulence over time. We can also manually control the evolution as well. So you can add keyframes to that. So maybe we'll turn this fractal speed up to about 1 or 2. 2 is fine. So you can see here we have this really cool turbulence. Check that out. So it's before and after. Boom. So we got 2 layers of turbulence. This is going to create a really fluid dynamic simulations. And just before we take a preview, I'd like to go to the particles and turn the life seconds down to about 1.5 so they don't exist for quite as long. Okay, looking pretty rad. We're almost finished with this particular part of the simulation. One thing I do want to add is a force, so we'll drag down a force node here and we'll connect this to the end of that chain. And let's go down to the force, and all the settings are pretty self-explanatory. We'll turn the gravity down a little bit, just so it'll kind of float up like that. And we can also change the wind Y, so it also floats up more, but we can go to the wind over life, and then we can bring this down towards the beginning and make it only exist right at the end here. So something kind of like that. So the wind only affects these end particles where it begins to frizz away. So that looks pretty cool to me. Sweet, looks really cool. Alright, so I'd also like to give a bit of color to these particles. So we'll do this by going to the particle, because we're coloring the particles, it kind of makes sense. And you can see here color, we'll change it from solid color to color over life, because that's kind of what we want it to do. So the way I kind of want this to work is it starts out more red, so you see this little box here, just click it and it'll open up a little color panel. We'll make this start out more red, so as it dies out it turns more of a blue color, something like that. And in the middle here we can kind of saturate that purple, just bring it up to that purplish pink there, kind of a pink color. So we can kind of squeeze these in a little bit. I like that blue color, so I'm going to squeeze it in a little bit. Okay, something kind of like that. So let's say we wanted a background to this scene, so I'll copy it from my other composition, paste it, and we have this nice background, right? So let's go ahead and parent it to the background motion. And there's a real problem here. You can see that these particles aren't following the motion of that background. They're just existing independently. And it creates this really unrealistic feel to these particles, as though they're not really in the same environment. So we're going to cover a really cool technique that helps blend particles into the environment. So pay close attention at least to this next part. So what we'll do is go to Stardust and add a transform node. And this transform node can transform the position of the whole scene, right? Depending on what it's connected to. But here it's not connected to anything, so it's going to transform the whole scene. So we can change the position X. It's going to change all the position X of all those particles. So what we'll do is add an expression to the position X. Open this up here. Let me close a few things. And let me open the position parameter of the background motion. And I'll pick whip this position X to the X position of the background motion. And we'll do the same thing for the Y position. Add expression, alternate, click the stopwatch, grab the pick whip, and connect it to the position Y. Okay, so you can see these particles are going to follow the background motion, but there really is a problem, which is they're not being emitted from the right place. They were at the right position until we added that transformation data. So if we just subtract that from the origin, they're going to be born at the right place, but the transformation node will still take place. So let's go to the emitter. Hopefully this will make sense once we do it. We'll go to the origin XY, go down here to this expression, and then what we'll do is we'll subtract subtract the background motion. So it's going to subtract the background motion so that the particles will give birth in the right place, yet they will still follow that background motion. So that's really cool. This is a really sweet technique that I hope you guys understand, because it's really going to help blending your particles into an environment. Okay, so to help you out with this turbulence, back to the turbulence, I want to show you a few more things. To help you out visualizing what a few of these things do, you can go up here to Stardust, go to Helpers, and then check Draw Helpers. Okay, this is going to help you visualize your turbulence, and there's a line for each turbulence node. So let's turn off one of the turbulence effects, and we can kind of visualize what some of these different features do. So the noise frequency might be kind of hard to understand, but you can just kind of change those values to see exactly what it does. But the frequency just basically controls the hardness or softness of the fractal displacement. So play around with it. For this first one, we're going to turn it to like 12. And I think that looks the best for how we want this simulation to appear. For the second one, we'll turn the frequency to about 10. So we can mess with the amplitude and all that stuff. And by the way, I think I decided to turn this position offset to 175 to give it a little bit more turbulence. I think it was at 100 before, and then we turned it up to 175 to give it some more turbulence. So I think it looks a little better that way. Alright, so now it's time to add the next element, and we're going to add some larger particles to this effect to add some contrast or some variation in the particle size. It'll really help it glitter or sparkle, help it look better. So it's always a good idea to add some larger particles with these kind of more fluid, dusty particles. So let's go ahead and do that now. So one really cool thing about Stardust is that you don't have to create new solids for different parts of your simulation. It's all in this node graph. We can just create more nodes, and that'll allow us to add different particles and different looks. So what we'll do is click on the emitter and hit Control D, and this is going to duplicate the emitter. So there's going to be two emitters, and we can create a new particle node, and we can connect this particle node to that emitter. So we can kind of see what's going on. There's far too many particles per second. What we'll do is go down here to this expression, double click, and we'll probably put parentheses around this whole expression. What we'll do is divide by some number like 40. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, something like that. We can even divide by more if we need to, just so that there's not so many particles. Let's go ahead and start adjusting these particles. So we'll go to the particle properties. We'll change the size to about 4 or so, and then we'll change the size random. The size random is important. Change that to about 75, so we can have some variation in these particle sizes. And I want to go to the size over life, and go to the Bezier, make it kind of fade in, and then fade out. So this size over life actually kind of takes down on the particle size, and that's okay. Alright, looks great. Let's turn the life of these particles down to about 1.5, the same as the other particles. I want to make some adjustments to this emitter. So I want these particles to scatter out a little bit more. So let's go to the speed over life. Let's get rid of all these, so just drag it out like that. You can't hit the delete button, that doesn't work. And we'll change this to linear. And let's just bring it up like this. So the velocity is going to start out greater, and then it's going to decrease. Okay, looks great. And we also want to change this speed random to about just all the way 100. Yeah, something like that. Okay, let's bring the speed down a little bit. Okay, so it's kind of more glued to the simulation. And we want to add a little bit of turbulence to these particles. So let's go ahead and drag in a new turbulence node, connect it to these particles. And let's go down here to the turbulence and go to the turbulence over life, make sure that it starts out with no turbulence, and turn the position offset to about 100, and we'll turn up the noise scale to about 200. Okay, looks pretty cool. That should work. We'll leave all the rest of these settings the same, since it's not really important, since we can't really visualize the structure of these scattered particles, but it does add a little bit of turbulence. I also do want to connect it to this turbulence node just to add a little bit more turbulence to these particles. So this one turbulence node is actually affecting both of these particles. I also want to go to these particles and turn the particle feather all the way up. Helps it look a little more natural. Alright, that looks great. Let's go ahead and focus on the color. Let's go to the color over life, open the color gradient, and we'll kind of do the same thing as what we did before. And possibly make them a little bit brighter. Okay, so that looks pretty cool. So the next element we'll be adding to the simulation is these particles that kind of branch out. They look pretty cool. It adds kind of a mystical feel to the simulation. So we're going to be adding some of these. Now, this can be kind of a difficult part. You know, messing with these simulations, you have to be creative, go back and play around with stuff, but I'll try to present this as straightforward as possible, not play around with stuff so we won't waste time, but every now and then I may have to go back and change some values because it's hard to get it right the very first time. So let's just try to go through this as good as we can, and we'll have fun playing around with some different ideas. We're just having fun trying to learn this Stardust software so you guys can start making some creations. So what we'll do is duplicate this last emitter we created, and we'll do that with Control D. Let's go ahead and create another particle node, attach this to the emitter, and you can see something kind of strange happens when these particles are way off over here. And let's not worry much about that right now. What we're going to do is create some auxiliary particles. I'll explain why this is happening later, why they're off to the side, but what we're going to do is create some auxiliary particles. So this is a new node that we haven't covered yet. So this is an auxiliary emitter. So this is a regular emitter, and regular emitters emit out of thin air, just emit from nothing. But auxiliary emitters emit from particles. So you can emit particles from particles with auxiliary emitters. So what we'll do is attach this auxiliary emitter to this particle node to say that we want new particles to emit from these particles. So this is just like an emitter. So that means we had to create a new particle node and attach these particles to the auxiliary emitter. Okay, so that should make sense. So what we have to do now is connect this to the transform node, but we'll do that by connecting it to the force node, and in turn it'll connect it to the transform node. So you can see these original particles actually are not affected by the transform node, but the auxiliary particles are, and that's okay because we're not going to have these particles visible anyway. So these are the auxiliary particles, and these are the emitter particles. First off, it's pretty obvious that there's too many of these particles. Let's start making some adjustments. So we'll go to the auxiliary emitter, and then we'll turn the speed down to 0, and that's really important because we're going to create trails. Alright, so it creates a trail behind those particles. So that's really cool. Alright, sweet. And now we want to go to these particles, the auxiliary particles, and turn down the size. Let's make these original particles last for a much shorter time, maybe something like 0.75 or maybe even less than that, but we'll do 0.75 for now. And these auxiliary particles need to exist for maybe 1 or 1.5 seconds. Okay, so they don't exist too far behind the simulation. Okay, looks pretty good. What we'll do now, if there's too many of these trails, what we can do is go to the particle, and instead of messing with the emitter particles per second, so there's an expression there, it's kind of hard to mess around with, what we can do is actually go to the particle and change the birth chance. So if we do a 50% chance, that means there's a 50% chance each particle will be born, which means there'll only be about half as many particles that are born. Okay, so that should make sense. What we'll do is play around with this emitter to get the particles, to get these trails the right length. So we'll turn the speed up a little bit, maybe 175. I'd like to mess with this a little bit. Yeah, I kind of want to do something like that. Turn the speed up a little bit. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is go to these parent particles and play with the size over life. Let's go to a point where we can kind of see these particles. What we'll do is just turn the size down over their life. And we want to go to the particle properties and make the size of these particles really small, maybe something like 0.5. And there's a reason for this. What we'll do is we'll actually define the size of these auxiliary particles by the size of the parent particles. So what we'll do is go to the auxiliary emitter, and we'll go to auxiliary inherit, and we'll do size percent 100. So that means it's going to 100% inherit the size of its parent. Okay, so we got something kind of cool going on here. And be sure to make these branches go out as far as you want by going up to the emitter and changing the speed. Okay, that looks pretty sweet. So these lines are a little too straight, and what we can do is add a turbulence node, and we'll unconnect this here, connect this here, connect the turbulence to the force. There we go, we got a nice tree going on. We'll go down to this turbulence node and turn up the position offset to about 25. Yeah, that looks pretty good, something like that. And we can mess with the noise scale, 125, just however that looks good. Turn off this emitter. There we go, we just have that part of the simulation. There we go, looking pretty mystical, pretty cool. If you can see some gaps in these trails, we can fix that by going to the auxiliary emitter and turning up the particles per second to maybe 200. That's going to up the opacity a little bit. To fix that, we can go to the particles, or to the parent particles, and turn down the size, since the auxiliary particles inherit the size, 0.25. Okay, that looks pretty sweet. Let's go ahead and colorize this so it blends with the rest of the simulation, and we'll just colorize these parent particles so that it'll colorize the auxiliary particles. So let's go to the color over life, go to the color gradient, and we'll just do the same kind of deal where we make it red, blue, and purple. There we go, not looking bad at all. Let's kind of crush some of this blue down. Alrighty, that looks pretty sweet. So let's blend this in with the rest of the simulation. Alrighty, I like it. If they're not visible enough, we can just go down over here to these parent particles, turn this up just a little bit. Alright, that looks pretty sweet. So we pretty much finished with this. So we'll do a few more adjustments. The first thing I'm going to do is actually go up to the project panel. So this is Stardust 01, and what we can do is actually duplicate this composition and drag the copy into the first composition. And what I want to do is first off remove the background, and I'm going to kind of delay this. So this is going to be right behind the other simulation. So what I'll do is grab the particle motion and move this forward in time so it's delayed a little bit. And then if it's necessary, we can go in here and make a few adjustments to this simulation so it's not a copy of the other one. So manually, probably the turbulence. If we change this, it should change the whole structure of the entire simulation. And so we'll go to the fractal offset Y and just change this to some random value. Fix it. We'll do this with several other ones. And let's go back to the original composition. And what we'll do is actually blend these together. So just like that. You can see how it makes the simulation a little bit thicker, a little bit fuller, adds more complexity. And we'll use a screen blending mode to blend these two together. I'm going to pre-compose everything except the background, so I got to make a copy of this null object so that background can track it just like that, and we'll pre-compose everything else. Okay, and we'll call this simulation. Alright, let's go ahead and shut off the background, and let's add some glow to this. So click on the simulation, add some curves actually to brighten this up a little bit just before we add the glow. So now what I want to do is add a solid composite, because this is completely transparent as of right now, so do solid composite. And this is just going to fill in that transparent data. So let's fill it in with black. Let's add some glow. And I'll put this at about 50% the threshold. And then I'll put the blending mode at screen. Let's do the radius 100, maybe 125. Okay, looks sweet. What we can actually do is duplicate the simulation layer. Let's remove all these effects. And then add some fast blur. Do a legacy fast blur. If you're in earlier versions of After Effects, it's just called fast blur. And we'll do it about maybe 100 also. And then we'll do another one. This is going to be a much broader glow, and then we'll fast blur it maybe 300. And then we'll duplicate this fast blur, and we'll blur it vertically like maybe 500 or 600. Add a levels effect. And go to the alpha and crush this down a little bit. Okay, so that's kind of brighten up the glow there. Yeah, I must say that looks pretty sweet. If you want more blue in there, I really like the blue colors, so we could probably increase this blue a little bit. Cool, something like that. So that pretty much wraps up the simulation. That covers pretty much everything. Now we did have like a glowing orb in the front of this for the original example. I can kind of copy that and show you how that all works together. And as I said, we're not going to go over this. It's going to take too much time. This tutorial is already too long. But I'm going to show you how you can kind of make these particles interact with the edge of the sphere. What you can do is we can add a field node, and we'll drag this down here, and we can go to the field properties, adjust the size, do this like 75, and you can see here that it's making this spherical displacement. So what we'd want to do is go to the origin XY, add an expression, and pick whip the origin XY of this field to the particle motion position. Okay, and it'll just be right there. Okay, so there we go. It looks pretty sweet, like, you know, these particles are interacting with the sphere. So that's how we did that. We may go over in some other tutorial about how we made this glowing orb, but this tutorial has gone on for pretty long, so we need to pretty much end it. Alright everyone, Superluminal Stardust. I hope you guys can see at this point how amazingly creative we can be with this plugin, how powerful it is. I mean, also know that we've only gone over a few of the different options we have. Emitters, particles, turbulence, forces, auxiliary emitters, transform nodes, and a little bitty glimpse into fields. But believe me, I've been going through some training with this plugin, and in this tutorial we've only scratched the very surface of what it can do. You guys be sure to at least get the trial version and play around with Stardust. Like I said, this plugin has just recently come out, so be one of the first people to get involved with it. Okay, have fun. I've certainly had fun making this effect with you guys. My name is Lendon from Visionary Universe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.